We all just had 4 hands. Thank you. Dear God, help us make sense of Jesus' difficult words. Once again, let us not take for granted what he has said and what he said with his life. Amen. On travels I took during a summer sabbatical a few years ago, I passed a rural highway sign, I think it was probably Idaho, in which a smiling preacher clutching a large Bible says, the Bible is the answer to every one of your problems. Which makes me wonder if that pastor ever actually read the Bible. I mean, okay, I found the Bible, of course, to contain, a fair amount of wisdom, but it never occurred to me that it is a self-help book, right? Frankly, I don't believe that Jesus is here to meet my every need, though sadly he's often sold like soap flakes with that in mind every day somewhere. It was Carl Jung who said so wisely, our serious problems cannot be solved. They can only be outgrown. So think about that for a minute. So, look, if you come to Jesus, with your questions, he is apt to leave you with more questions than with answers. Come to Jesus with your problems, and he may diminish your anxiety with his well-articulated words about peace, but he may also give you new problems you would never have had before you met him. So my justification for talking like this comes, of course, from the way Jesus speaks to us in this morning's gospel. He is becoming popular. His numbers look positive, and he's testing well in focus groups. Luke says there's a great crowd now clustering around him, and you might think Jesus would be pleased by the size of the crowd. Take the crowd's magnitude as confirmation of the validity of his message. But no, what he says to the crowd is sure to reduce its size considerably. Whoever comes to me and doesn't hate father and mother, spouse and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even one's own life, cannot be my disciple. Whoever doesn't carry their own cross and follow me can't be my disciple. Not the most inviting lead-in which to begin a sermon. So far from trying to make it easier for people to follow him, he points out how hard it is. He's talking to a company of people that has begun following him, from town to town. They are not people he has called, though. They have simply shown up, full of enthusiasm. But Jesus is something less than welcoming. He tells them not to get their hopes up, and that more than likely they can't afford what they think they want. He suggests that they go home and do some sober feasibility studies before deciding to burn any bridges in order to follow him. And you can be sure some of these people are puzzled. Because look, they adore him. They are like what we call deadheads, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. We may even have some here. They have chosen to live on the road. They can't wait for the next show in the next town, even if it sounds a lot like the last one. And you can be sure Jesus repeated his stories and parables over and over and over. There's something about the energy, though, that he exudes that they have to be close to, no matter what they are missing back home. Because, this is the ancient world where people seldom traveled more than a dozen miles from their birthplace in a lifetime. They sense he will be opening up a brand new world any day now, and they think they're willing to pay any price to be there when it happens. But Jesus has qualms about possibly misleading them. I like that about this text. It's like they are 14 years old and they think they're running off with a circus, when instead he knows they are headed to a kind of battle, unarmed and untrained. At the tail end of that sabbatical I mentioned when I started, I spent 10 days in England. I was staying with a dear family friend in a sleepy little town in the Cotswolds, where nothing ever happens. It's the kind of place that Jane Marple calls home, if you read the Agatha Christie whodunits. You know, breakfast followed by morning tea, and then boom, it's lunch, and then it's afternoon tea. That's how people live there. But while I was there, the circus came to town. It wasn't a big circus, but it was a pretty fun one. Anyway, I was having breakfast on the main street one of those mornings in a little restaurant called simply The Kitchen. And I found myself sitting next to a principal member of the circus, a young man of about 28, and I couldn't help myself. So I asked him the question in my mind, which was, did you run away and join the circus? And without missing a beat, he gave me a kind of half-joyful kind of yes, and then added, one morning my wife left me, and by mid-afternoon I had joined the circus. Note to self, how to deal with a catastrophe. Join the circus. So okay then, back to the text here. Why does Jesus say all these disturbing things about hating your mother? One biblical interpreter, Barbara Brown Taylor, suggests that maybe he's using a kind of figure of speech unfamiliar to us today in our culture. Barbara put it this way. She said that in Jesus' day, the way you stated a preference was to pair two things and say you hate one of them and love the other. It didn't have anything to do with real emotion then. It was a matter of priorities. So if I said, I love the mountains and hate the beach, it would not actually mean that I felt hostile to the waves and Haystack Rock. It would mean that the Mount Hood country was what I warmed to mostly when it came to beautiful views in nature. I don't know that this helps a lot, but it does seem to me that priorities are clearly what is on Jesus' mind in this passage. He's on his way, remember, to Jerusalem, and he knows what a hard road he has ahead of him, and to that fact, the followers that he has are going to have to be persecuted if they align themselves with him. And to have one rowdy Christian in your family meant that everyone in your family was liable to be arrested in maybe the church Luke is preaching to. So it's true then that a turn toward Jesus was by definition a turn away from your family, whether you wanted that or not. Once a person made it their priority to follow him, everything else fell away. Not because God had anything to do with it, but because that was just the way the world was working. As long as the world opposes those who set out to transform it, the transformers are going to pay a heavy price. Remember Nelson Mandela, or think of Liz Cheney for that matter. I think that's what Jesus wants us to know. He's not threatening us. He is not trying to bedevil us with impossible demands. Out of sheer love, he is refusing to make following him seem any easier than it is. Why? Because he doesn't want anyone to get halfway through building a tower and have to abandon it, right? Or go charging into any battle of any kind without the troops needed to prevail. Now, if all this sounds overly dramatic, then maybe it's a sign that we've lost track of what following him is really about. Is following Jesus about being a good, stable citizen who is family-oriented? Or is there something about changing the world that might involve personal risk? Personal risk. Because look, the kingdom of God, the reign of God that he talks about in the Sermon on the Mount sure doesn't look much like the world we're living in here in 2022, does it? Because, you know, he said, blessed are the peacemakers. Do good to those who persecute you. Those are not ethics that a lot of people, I mean, a lot of Christians are even following or linking to Jesus himself. It's following Jesus about being part of some airtight, hermetically sealed environment where nothing that upsets us ever knocks on our door. Or might following Jesus get us in trouble with someone in authority once in a while? Because that's clearly what he is asking. One of my favorite preachers of yesteryear was Ernie Campbell, who once said, "If I'm following Jesus, why am I such a good insurance risk?" Mighty good question. A young man who grew up in a church I served some years ago now lives in Klamath Falls. He's only about 34, but he's already retired from his first career. He was a top 40 bull rider. Now, that's very lucrative business when you get to that incredible level. But you have to face the world's meanest bulls to do that. And he retired after breaking his neck and arm and back more than once. When he was in the thick of it, I asked his mother how she could afford insurance for him. And she said no broker ever asked her any questions. But she said, if he'd been an underwater welder, I couldn't have afforded it. I wonder if Jesus thought following him was like being an underwater welder, where the average life expectancy is about 35. Whoever comes to me and does not hate mother, father, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Discipleship can cost all we have, all we love, all we are. That is less God's doing, as I was saying earlier, than our own. If the world were kinder to its reformers, following Jesus' ethic might be a piece of angel food cake, but it is not. And Jesus doesn't want anyone to be fooled who is willing to follow him. Let's not forget that he went out of this world on an instrument of torture, a Roman cross. In my last church in Salt Lake City, 2 mornings a month, I'd sit on some steps below the traditionally placed pulpit, and about 70 kids at a time from our church's preschool would gather, and we'd look into a Bible story of one sort or another together for a few minutes. And once, while waiting for all those classes to gather, they came in one by one, I was visiting with one of the 4-year-olds, a little boy, and he was asking about our many stained glass windows in that church, and we looked together at the one closest to us, which was Jesus on a cross. And then he shook his little head and said, and I will quote him, "Jesus is always dying." Jesus is always dying. And it was one of those times, when you realize it takes a child to sum something up for you. I don't know where he might have gone to church on a Sunday or what books he'd been looking into, but he knew the odd and awful fact that when you see Jesus, he is most often hanging on a cross, and it is sure not pretty. Jesus is always dying, and it sure better as hell means something. I mean, he's always offering to share it with us too, asking us to get underneath it with him, help him carry it in some way, the way he speaks of it in this text today. And not, I think, because he wants us to suffer or to lighten his load in any way. No, and listen to this, maybe it's because he wants us to know how alive you can feel underneath something that heavy. I mean this sincerely. How it can take your breath away. To embrace what Jesus says is our top priority, a Christian's one true necessity, defending things like truth and justice and something as fragile as democracy, and doing it with your whole self because you know it's what you are called to do. Remember the protests that went on a couple of years ago in Hong Kong? Remember the young people who crowded the streets to say they didn't want to live in a totalitarian state? I will never forget what one of those young protesters said. He said, "We're all going to die anyway. Why not for this?" They were part of something that they hoped would change the world, and they were saying that they had never felt so alive in their lives. Jesus must have known this in his bones, too. I remember participating, we have our slide. I remember participating myself in a demonstration 5 years ago in front of the Federal Building in downtown Salt Lake City. I took that picture. President Trump was in town, and there were just 36 of us making our disdain for his policy about separating children from their parents and locking them in cages heard. We hung out there in the middle of a downtown intersection for a good long time, there right in view of the Capitol. Long enough for the president to be tipped off that we were there. He was shocked that even in a deep red state like Utah, he would find pushback, and said it made him angry. So under pressure from the governor of Utah, the Salt Lake police sent out a fully outfitted SWAT team just as we were about to wind things up and go home. I didn't even know Salt Lake City had a SWAT team. But I'll tell you, it was something watching all those tall policemen who vastly outnumbered us get out of their buses with their batons and shields and flint black uniforms. They formed a line, and this adrenaline went through me the way I cannot remember. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced, except maybe once or twice when I was working for the fire department back in college days when I was about 20. And the police, they're right there. I need to say were wonderful. They didn't want to be there. They were just doing their job that day, and they smiled at us as wide as possible through their visors to let us know that. After a few minutes of letting them know why we were there at the top of our lungs, we all went home. But I will not ever forget the feeling, the adrenaline, the rush. It gets your blood up like nothing else on earth, except, I imagine, unless you're in a war. Honestly, I don't know what I would do if I really thought my life was in danger. I don't know what I would do if push really came to shove. Perhaps the answer would have to do with what I felt was at stake, right? What we might be able to lose if some of us didn't stand up. I don't know. 15 years ago, the church I was pastoring hosted the parents of Rachel Corey. Remember her name? Rachel Corey was the supremely idealistic young woman who at age 25 was single-handedly trying to save a Palestinian family's house from being bulldozed by the Israeli military in Gaza. Wearing a fluorescent orange jacket, she was run over on the spot by the tractor doing the demolition. Now, I happen to be the father of a very spirited and very principled daughter, so it was sobering and scary for me to hear Rachel's parents in our church honor their daughter's courage. The thing that hit me the hardest was when her mother told us that when she was raising her 3 tiny daughters, Rachel among them, she'd wanted to keep a diary so she could write down some of the amazing things that they were saying every day. But here's the rub. She didn't have the energy to do that, she confessed. She said that parenting was so exhausting that she often fell asleep before they did. That's just the way it is for some moms and dads, especially if you got 3 little ones. Anyway, one morning, Rachel, aged 2, said something her mother just had to write down. She said, "Mama, is brave part of growing up?" You know, it's all there in the child when she's born, every bit of it. the spirit, the soul, whatever it is at the core, is fully formed. And here's the deal. I think that what Jesus is saying in this text today is that putting your life on the line is probably not for everyone. That's why he offers it as an invitation. There are not a lot of people who, like Rachel Corrie, have what it takes to shoulder the cross when it really counts. But I do not think that the rest of us, more timid ones, are lost because that scares us. Not for a minute. No, instead, I think Jesus just wants us not to take it for granted. Not take for granted the sacrifice he made and Rachel made and thousands of others have made since he left this earth. Many of them having made those sacrifices in his name. I think he just wants us to not forget what it really costs. Amen.